This is John Whiting for Pacifica Radio in London. During this folio period, you'll be hearing a number of concerts, dramatic readings, and discussions recorded during a 3-month Festival of American Arts and Humanities, presented at the American Embassy by the U.S. Information Service. The program you are about to hear was produced as a summary report of the festival to Congress. At times, its salesmanship may be a bit blatant for Pacifica listeners, but it does give an accurate picture of how the festival was conceived and carried out. The excerpts are in some cases previews of programs which you'll hear in their entirety, and in others, brief samples of events which couldn't be released for broadcast. You're listening to the Washington Cathedral Choir, recorded during its appearance in London during the month of April 1966 as part of the 900th anniversary celebration at Westminster Abbey. Their appearance also marked the beginning of the American Embassy's Festival of American Arts and Humanities. During the months of April, May, and June, the Embassy presented more than 40 concerts, plays, lectures, and exhibits, giving Londoners the opportunity to familiarize themselves with many aspects of American culture. For the next hour, you'll hear some of the highlights of the festival, those which lent themselves most readily to preservation through sound recording. Such a brief survey can't pretend to be complete. We can only hope to hint at the variety and excitement of this project. The festival was inaugurated on April 6th by Ambassador David Bruce, with a succinct statement of its conception and purpose.
During the next 80 days of April, May, and June, the American Embassy will be presenting its first Festival of American Arts and Humanities. The festival has been conceived by the United States Information Service as a tribute to the National Foundation on the Arts and the Humanities Act of 1965, which was signed into law by President Johnson on September 29, 1965. In its declaration of purpose, this new act of Congress confirms the government's responsibility and concern, first for the encouragement and support of national progress and scholarship in the humanities and the arts, second for a form of education designed to make men masters of their technology and not its unthinking servants, third to help create and sustain not only a climate encouraging freedom of thought, imagination, and inquiry, but also the natural conditions facilitating the release of creative talent. No government can call a great artist or scholar into existence. It can, however, and should, nourish and sustain in its people leadership in the realm of ideas and of the spirit. This new act of Congress ventures in such a direction. Similarly, the Festival of American Arts and Humanities will attempt, with the cooperation of Americans visiting or resident here, as well as of our British colleagues, to present a rich and varied selection of programs in the arts and the humanities. I extend to all festival participants my best wishes for the success of their festival ventures.
ain't no use a-listening for his tired footsteps climbing up the stairs. Old man sorrows come to keep me company, whispering beside me when I say my prayers.
That, of course, is the familiar voice of Barbra Streisand. But you're listening to her under very unusual circumstances. Not on a commercial recording or for a large theater audience, but in an intimate and informal history of American musical theater, presented before an invited audience at the London Embassy. Miss Streisand was joined by some of the best performers and producers in musical comedy. The narrator was Hal Prince, who, as the director or producer of such remembered classics as The Pajama Game, The Matchmaker, and Damn Yankees, was able to speak as a participant rather than an observer. For the first part of the program, he was joined by two young but experienced stars, Anita Gillette and Lee Ellen. Then, in the second half, the show was taken over by one of the most brilliant talents in the American musical theater today, the pianist, entertainer, and composer of Sweet Charity, Cy Coleman.
The minute you walked in the joint, I could see you were a man of distinction, a real big spender, good looking, so refined. Say, wouldn't you like to know what's going on in my mind? So let me get right to the point. I don't pop my cork for every guy I see. Hey, big spender, spend a little time with me. Oh, would you like to have fun, fun, fun? How's about a few laughs, laughs? I can show you a good time. Let me show you a good time. The minute you walked in the joint, I could see you were a man of distinction, a real big spender, good looking, so refined. Say, wouldn't you like to know what's going on in my mind? So let me get right to the point. I don't pop my cork for every guy I see. Hey, big spender, hey, big spender, hey, big spender, spend a little time with me. Thank you very much. I hope you didn't mind me soliciting a few tickets. There's our big ballad in this show, which is the moment of self-revelation. And this particular song, we were very fortunate. We had gotten to record this, one of the greatest recording artists of our country and possibly of all time. And we were just very happy about it, and I'd like to do this song for you. It's called Where Am I Going?
Where am I going, and what will I find? What's in this grab bag that I call my mind? What am I doing myself which way is clear. When you've lost your way year after year, do I keep falling in love for just the kick of it staggering through the thin and thick of it, hating each old and tired trick of it? Know what I am, I'm good and sick of it. Where am I going? Why do I care? Run where it's foul, run where it's fair. No matter where I run, I meet myself there looking inside me. What do I see? Anger and hope and doubt. What am I all about? And where am I going? Tell me, why do I care? No matter where I run, I meet myself there looking inside me. What do I see? Anger and hope and doubt. What am I all about? And where am I going? Where am I
The audience was almost as enthusiastic as the ambassador himself when, at a very tender age, he witnessed his first musical comedy.
I went to my first musical comedy 64 years ago, and for me it was a rather curious experience. And if you'll forgive me for a moment or two, I'll tell you why. It was on my 4th birthday. I was extremely inebriated. And I was accompanied by my great-grandmother, who was then 102 years old. The star was Mr. George M. Cohen, later and more popularly known as the American Yankee Doodle Dandy. Now, this particular event left an indelible impression on me and made me a devotee of the stage, not alone the musical achievements which it has represented, but in almost every particular for reasons which now I'm going to trespass on your patience by referring to. I'm a native of Baltimore, Maryland, and I was brought up in the house of a great-grandmother. Through a rather miraculous business, which has happened to other people, I must admit, she had completely recovered her eyesight, and in her 90s could read the finest print without glasses. But her hearing was, as she put it, somewhat impaired, which is rather an understatement of the true state of affairs. But as she always sat in the front row of the theater, she finally resolved that anything musical was more to her taste than other forms of entertainment, because I think quite properly, she said, it's a delicious noise. And so it was under those circumstances that I went, as I said, on my 4th birthday. Now, I must make another remark about my dear great-grandmother. She's rather given to drink. And had the habit, which she said was excellent for her health, but I think she rather favored it for other reasons as well, of imbibing a good deal of champagne both at lunch and dinner. So when we set forth on this famous occasion, I was told, commanded, because that's what she always did, to swallow a tumbler of champagne, which I did without blinking an eye. And those were the carriage days, the horse and buggy days, except this wasn't really a buggy. They were rather meddlesome horses who only came out once a week, charged all over the place, and really were a menace to traffic, but particularly to those who were contained in the carriage. At any rate, we get to the theater. She drags me down the aisle, and I sat there very quietly and thought this was going to be a great occasion. And I must say, Mr. Cohen afterwards wrote a very polite note to my great-grandmother and said, I feel so obligated to you because of the tremendous enthusiasm displayed throughout my performance for your great-grandson. The truth of the matter is that I never ceased to applaud.
Behind the festival lay many months of planning, publicity, and hard work. Dr. Martin Carroll, the Deputy Cultural Attaché, tells something of how the festival came into existence.
Well, a number of things made the festival possible. There was, first of all, the passage by Congress in September of '65 of the National Foundation of the Arts and Humanities Act, which for the first time put the federal government formally in the position of assisting and subsidizing both the arts and the humanities as a new venture on a nationwide scale. It seemed to us that this act should be commemorated, and all of the things which flow out of it should be commemorated. There is, for example, the tremendous richness and variety of what has been called within the past year the cultural explosion in the United States. There is the rather amazing development in our universities in the fields of research and academic activity, which has burgeoned since World War II. In London here, we're especially conscious of all this because so many American artists in all categories of the performing arts and the humanities come to London and drop into the embassy and often express their interest in working cooperatively with us in various types of cultural and educational and artistic programs. So the festival was conceived as something which would commemorate this act and try to indicate its significance not only for the United States but also for the rest of the world, and particularly, of course, for London and our own embassy here.
What sort of budget did you have to work with?
Well, as you perhaps know, our budget and our personnel in the U.S. Information Service here in London was cut back very rigorously. We felt the rigor of these cutbacks about last December, and this was about the time when we decided that despite the lack of funds and personnel, we would go ahead, depending largely upon the enthusiasm of the few people we still have remaining here in the embassy, and upon the large, what shall I call, free will offerings of so many artists that we knew would cooperate with us.
And to judge from the festival, in fact, the response was quite tremendous and cooperative from people that you asked.
Well, the vast majority of people that we approached responded immediately with enthusiastic agreement in principle. From that point on, we had to coddle them along a bit and also work out arrangements for dates and times and places, because all of these are very busy men and women. There was a great deal of voluntary work done, and without it, of course, the festival would not have been possible.
Yes, and speaking of voluntary work, I've noticed myself the vast amount of voluntary overtime being put in by staff members, both British and American, to make this thing possible.
But once you announce that you're going to have a festival, that it's going to be for 3 months, and that you're going to have about 40 events, actually the number of events came close to 50 or 60, and everybody makes a commitment to the success of this venture, time means nothing and the hours mean nothing also.
I thought one of the, from an English writer's point of view, one of the most significant things about American literature is its lack of Americanness, in the sense that it is so regional. And I couldn't...
As George Bernard Shaw has pointed out, the Americans and the British are divided by the insuperable barrier of a common language. American literature can be problematical to the English, and indeed to ourselves. To resolve some of this confusion, the festival sponsored a symposium entitled, What is American in American Literature? The principal speakers were Marcus Cunliffe, head of the American Studies Department of the University of Sussex, Reuben Brower, professor of English at Harvard University, and Cleanth Brooks, one of America's greatest literary critics, and for the past 2 years, cultural attaché at the American Embassy in London. More than 50 participants were invited. including some of the best writers, critics, and scholars in England. The result was a stimulating and provocative examination of our literary legacy.
Think of any European writers who have in fact successfully, at some length, I mean, not just for a paragraph, caught the tone of America as expressed through an American character which a European has thought up. Can you think of any?
I can't think of any. As a matter of fact, I think one of the curious things is that the longer James stayed in this country, the less hold he had on American speech. You begin to feel that he's lost it. And it must be very much as with a poet that you must be in that language, really in it, as you're saying, if you're going to use it convincingly.
I'm thinking of the American quality which underlies all American literature, insofar as it can be seized and identified, and if it could be seized and identified in the work of non-American writers, it would be a useful indication of its identity. But in fact, it's too difficult, evidently, for non-American writers to catch hold of.
Surely this is because, as Professor Cunliffe said, it doesn't exist. He gave us various ways of demonstrating that it doesn't exist. On the other hand, once one said that it doesn't exist, then it's perfectly clear that there is something which is specifically American.
But there are other ways of making our literature comprehensible, even the idiomatic complexities of American humor. This tradition was brought to life in 2 evenings of concert readings by a company of young American and English actors under the direction of George Mully. Those represented ranged from Benjamin Franklin to James Thurber, by way of Mark Twain, Artemus Ward, and a full 36 major and minor authors. The presiding genius was Donald Ogden Stewart.
And, of course, one of the great humorists of the 20s was a newspaper man in Chicago, Ring Lardner, who started out as a sports writer and then gradually came to write some of the really fine short stories. But I'm sorry we can't give you a sample of his better talents, but the thing that we're going to show you tonight was written by him. The Authors League had a banquet, the annual banquet in 1923, and they asked the various humorists to contribute. And so Ring wrote this play, and it was performed by Bob Benchley and myself. I read the words, and Bob played the mandolin all during my words. And after the banquet, then I went, everybody went to Paris in those days. And I went to Paris, and I happened to run into a man named Ernest Hemingway. And I showed him this piece of Ring's, and it just fitted completely. He was at the time editing the Transatlantic Review with Ford Maddox Ford, and he wrote an editorial because Ernest didn't really like Dada poetry very much, and he sort of thought that this thing of Ring's, and he was right too, was so much better Dada than Zara had ever thought of. And so we're going to start with Ernest Hemingway's editorial about this, and then we're going to give you Ring Lardner's drama that he wrote for the Authors League banquet.
We had written an editorial. It was all about Monsieur Cocteau, who does not, we believe, know English, translating Romeo and Juliet, and the snobism of language in general, and how pleasant it is to appear to really know languages other than our own, and how difficult it is to do so, and what profound admiration we have for Americans who really do know French, and how tired we get of others who pretend to, and how very much better Dadas, the American Dadas, who do not know they are Dadas, are than the French and Romanians who know it so well, and so on and so on and so on, and it all seemed very dull and not worth writing. And then Mr. Don Stewart, whom Mr. Tzara cannot read in the original, and we feel sure has not yet read in translation, brought us a thing called I Gasperi by Ring Lardner. Now, for its publication, we are indebted primarily to Mr. Lardner, secondarily to Mr. Stewart, and in the tertiary stage to Mr. Ben Hecht, who borrowed it from Mr. Stewart to copy and then printed it in the Chicago Literary Times, from which we reprint it. Now, our only regret is that Mr. Tsara will be unable to read it, but there may ultimately be a translation. By that time, though, Mr. Tsara will probably be too busy on a translation of Marlowe or some other Elizabethan to bother.
E. Gaspery, or The Upholsterers. A drama in 3 acts by Ring Lardner, adapted from the Bucovinen of Caspar Redmond. Characters: Ian Aubrey, a blotter salesman. Johann Vasper, his wife. Greta, their daughter. Herbert Swope. Faina, their daughter, later their wife. Egso, a pencil guster. Tono, a typical wastebasket. Act 1. A public street in a bathroom. A man named Tupper has evidently just taken a bath. A man named Brindle is now taking a bath. A man named Newman comes out of the faucet which has been left running. He exits through the exhaust. 2 strangers to each other meet on the bath mat.
Where was you born?
Out of wedlock.
That's mighty pretty country around there.
Are you married?
I don't know. There's a woman living with me, but I can't place her.
3 outsiders named Klein go across the stage 3 times. They think they're in a public library. A woman's cough is heard off stage left. A new character.
Who is that cough?
2 Moors.
That was my mother. She died a little while ago in a very haphazard way.
A Greek.
Ah, and what a woman she was!
The curtain is lowered for 7 days to denote the lapse of a week. Act 3. The Lincoln Highway. 2 bearded glue lifters are seated at one side of the road.
Translator's note. The principal industry in Fleisch is hoarding hay. Peasants sit alongside of a road on which the hay wagons are likely to pass. When a hay wagon does pass, the hay hoarders leap from their points of vintage and help themselves to a wisp of hay. On an average, a hay hoarder accumulates a ton of hay every 4 years. This is called mahjong.
The first glue lifter speaks.
Well, my man, how goes it?
The second glue lifter sings My Man to show how it goes.
Sometimes I say if I just could get away with
8 realtors cross the stage in a friendly way. They are out of place. Curtain!
The visual arts were represented by several major exhibits in the embassy lobby. Bernard Lang, manager and English liaison officer for the festival, talks about their considerable scope and variety.
Well, the original concept was two-way. First of all, to record important influences in America today, and secondly, to illustrate the work and perhaps even the British influence upon the work of American artists resident in Britain. In the first context, we had a highly successful show of contemporary American lithographs covering the work of 12 artists, among them John Paul Jones, Louise Nevelson, George Miyazaki, the very popular in Britain Robert Rauschenberg, Esteban Vicente. And then the highly important show, the first time we've ever had a retrospective in Europe of this particularly important influence, the work of Stuart Davis. In the past, the exhibitions have been put together, compiled for overseas tours by the United States Information Agency, which just in effect found this work too great And now the responsibility for this compilation has gone to the Smithsonian Institution, to which 3 U.S. Information Agency officers have been assigned, particularly, of course, to the National Collection of Fine Arts in Washington.
And in between these 2 major exhibits, there were several others which covered the whole span of the festival. You might tell us something about them, if you could, chronologically.
Well, basically, this was the work of American artists in Britain. There were 5 artists whose names occurred to me. Francis Kelly, Alfred Cohen, John Hubbard, a young and coming American sculptor Antonis Brasdis, and then the internationally known Ronald Kittai. We approached all 5. They submitted 10 works each and got us off to our first exhibition under the title 5 American Artists in Britain. We were then slightly alarmed that we might have left out an important American artist over here, and it was not our job or our purpose to hurt anybody. And so we, by approaching art colleges, galleries, dealers, and putting a notice in art magazines, we held a jury selection to which 62 artists contributed 166 works. From this initial submission of works, the 3-man jury, Anglo-American jury, selected 48 works, I believe it was, covering 29 American artists. And then, incidentally, at the time of the Stuart Davis, in our second gallery, we showed the work of up-and-coming American artists, at least we hope they will be. That is the work of children at American Air Force dependent schools in Britain.
Were you faced with any inordinate difficulties in putting the exhibitions together?
Only money.
America's greatest jazz musicians have been coming to London in increasing numbers, and 3 of them, prior to a major public appearance at the Royal Festival Hall, transformed the Embassy's theater into an intimate and exciting jazz club. At the moment, you're listening to one of the high points of a session in which trumpeter Rex Stewart joined the excellent British band of Alex Welsh in a brief but unforgettable survey of jazz history. During the same week, there were concerts by tenor saxophonist Bud Freeman and one of the greatest jazz pianists of all time, Earl Hines.
Yes, baby. You know, I'll probably take this little opportunity right here to tell you what I'm doing. I'm actually on what we call an evangelistic tour. A musical evangelistic tour. Let's get it straight, you know. And sort of rebuilding the wonderful profession of the musicians. It was wonderfully great when I first came into it because it was something that you really looked forward to. And we've had a few in our organization that has made some bad mistakes. So we're trying to rectify that by letting people know that there's another side of this music business, that there are some people that really take it seriously. We're trying to kind of return it around, let you know that it takes time to learn this thing. That's too fast. I didn't mean to do that.
The establishment of a National Arts Council in America has aroused considerable interest and curiosity in England, where government sponsorship is partly responsible for London's cultural preeminence. On behalf of the Council, Isaac Stern, one of its most active and distinguished members, answered questions put to him by Richard Findlater, assistant editor of The Observer, Hans Keller of the BBC, Michael Frostick of Pay TV, and Sir Robert Mayer, sponsor of many cultural activities for youth. The chairman of the discussion was Ernest Fleischmann, General Secretary of the London Symphony Orchestra. Mr. Stern proved to be an eloquent and informed spokesman.
In the United States, we have come to a general use of the arts rather lately, but at a pace that is astonishing. You must remember, too, that we are fortunate. We have not been visited by war physically. We do not know what destruction and terror mean on our doorstep. They also are a wealthy nation. They have more leisure time and more money. And they turn violently to recreation. And with all this has also come the beginnings of an idea of living a little more intelligently. There are higher standards. And for this, I must say that I grant, first of all, in large measure, the terrible times that Europe went through between 1933 and 45, when America inherited so many fine minds and spirits who helped us enormously and who became resident and took root in America. 40 years ago, 90% of our orchestral musicians were foreign-born. Today, over 90% are American-born and trained. Though each of them can point to either a European parent 2 or 3 generations back, and certainly a European teacher or result of European teaching a generation or 2 back. To that extent, too, I feel that the United States has a responsibility to cherish, to accept this wealth that it has received, to encourage it, to recognize it, to live with it, and to return some of this wealth to the world. If we can, through our efforts and through our fraternity of ideas and feelings, exchange fruitfully to each of our advantages with Europe what we try, so much better it will be for all of us. All of this comes because we are performers and artists in truth within our beings. All of these things that I'm involved with, for example, as Mr. Bernstein is from time to time, these are important to us, but they're peripheral. They come out of this glorious feeling of getting onto a stage and saying something to people who want to listen. And once you have the idea of identification with communication with someone else, then you must become rabid as to the importance of communication. That is why we are involved. Because we feel that through our work and through our playing, through what makes us tick, we live with human beings and sometimes for the betterment of human beings. And if we can add to it, we try. And none of us is ever going to give it up for a desk job. Be sure of that. It has no advantages whatsoever for us.
American composers and performers were ably represented in several concerts at the Embassy Theater. Taylor Vrooman presented an evening of ballads and tavern songs from colonial Williamsburg. Wilfred Mellors and Noel Lee provided a musically illustrated lecture on the piano works of Aaron Copland. The Fine Arts Quartet were heard in the English premiere of Samuel Adler's String Quartet, and the New York Chamber Soloists, with tenor Charles Bressler, performed several contemporary American compositions, including the Cantata No. 1 on Elizabethan texts by Hugh Aitken, from which we hear the setting of the poem Pluck the Fruit by Thomas Lodge.
Pluck the fruit and taste the pleasure, youthful lordings of delight, whilst occasion gives you seizure, feed your fancies and your sight. After death, when you are gone, joy and pleasure is there none. Here on earth no thing is stable, fortune's changes well are known, whilst as youth doth then enable that your seeds of joy be sown. After death, when you are gone, joy and pleasure is there none. Feasted freely with your lovers, blithe and wanton sweets do fade, whilst that lovely Cupid hovers round about this lovely shade. Sported freely one to one, after death is pleasure none. Now the pleasant spring allureth, and both place and time invite, but alas, what God endureth to disclaim his sweet delights. After death, when we are gone, joy and pleasure is there none.
The limited stage of the Embassy Theater did not prevent the presentation of at least one major play, the classical French tragedy Phèdre by Jean Racine. The production came to London from the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Theater Arts, New York, and featured two of America's outstanding actresses, Beatrice Straight and Mildred Dunnock. This theatrical cross-fertilization, as the London Times put it, placed a distinguished American cast under the direction of Paul-Émile Debet of the Paris Comédie Française. From a recording made during the last performance at the Embassy, we hear a brief scene in which Hippolyte confronts his father, Theseus, not knowing that his stepmother, Phèdre, has unjustly charged him with treacherous and unnatural assault. The actors are Michael Durrell and Reed Shelton.
Traitor and slave, how dare you stand before me here? Sky's brightest lightning bolt should throw you to the void, almost the last outlaw of those I have destroyed. After this ugly lust had come into your head and led you to defame your father's wedding bed, you still present yourself and show your hated face, and so parade your shame throughout this fatal place, and do not go away under some foreign sun where my own name may be unknown to everyone. Fly, traitor! Do not try to brave my hatred now, so go. while my great rage is kept inside somehow. It is enough for me to bear my own despair for having brought you forth into the living air, without your death as well dishonoring my name and spoiling endlessly the splendor of my fame. Fly! Unless you want a swift and fatal blow to add you to the beasts that I myself brought low.
Now irritated by so foul and black a lie, I feel I should reveal the truth in my reply, my lord.
Yet I suppress something which touches you. You should approve my tact, my duty to subdue. Without the slightest wish of stirring up more strife, remember who I am and look through my whole life. All know I suffer from so strict and harsh an art. The light of day is not as pure as my own heart. Yet they say evil leaves obsessed by some strange
This is
flame.
the same high pride that damned you to your shame. I see what evil hides behind your cold disguise. For only Phaedra alone could charm your brazen eyes, and for all other loves your sly and lifeless soul could never once catch fire, but kept its self-control.
No, my father. This heart, it's too much to conceal, has not refused a love for someone chaste and real. Here at your feet I make my great apology. I love, it's true what you forbid to me, for I love Arisi. It is already done, the daughter of Pallas has overcome your son. I worship her, and I defying all your laws. Am lost in the sighs of which she is the cause.
You love her? But no. This trick is to distract. Act like a criminal to cover up your act.
My lord! For 6 long months I fought this love for her. I came here trembling now to tell you this news, sir. But how? Can anything erase this great mistake? Can any oath I take persuade you for my sake? By this earth, by this sky, by nature all in all.
Always false hypocrites perjure their own downfall. No, do not bore me with more of your fine lies, if your dishonesty can find no new disguise.
You think all of this is false and full of subtlety? But fed in her own heart is much more fair to me.
Ah! Your crude impudence makes me more angry now.
Where will I be exiled and how long is your vow?
Far beyond the pillars of Hercules would not be far enough.
Awful crime! What friends will pity me when you abandon me?
Go and invent new friends, whose own dishonesty congratulates incest, applauds adultery, outlaws without conscience, traitors who know no law, able to care for you and share your brazen flaw.
You keep on speaking of incest, adultery. I do not speak. But Fed comes from her family, her mother's blood, my lord. You know it very well is worse than mine and filled with all the filth of hell.
What? Have you lost all sense that you rage in my face? For the last time, get out. Away from this great place. Go, traitor. Do not wait for your own father's hand to drive you forcefully before you leave this land. Wretched! You are running to your own ruin now. Neptune, god of that sea which all gods fear, somehow has given me his word, and he will make it good. You cannot flee a god. Let that be understood. I loved you. And I sense, in spite of your great crime, the pain you must endure in such a little time. But you condemned yourself. And now the deed is done. Has any father been so outraged by a son?
Almost all of these scheduled events took place as advertised, in spite of several major crises. For instance, the Oberlin Baroque Ensemble, after being held up by an airstrike, arrived in London only an hour before their concert and went straight to the stage, without rehearsal, to a triumphantly successful recital of demanding contemporary and Baroque works. From the end of that program, we hear the last movement of the Trio Sonata in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach. Certainly the Festival of American Arts and Humanities has been an artistic success. But what about its public success in this culture-saturated city of London? One indication was the demand for tickets. Frequently there were more than twice as many applicants as there were seats to accommodate them, and repeat performances seemed to stimulate an even larger demand. Another indication of success has been the response of the London critics, who live upon a daily diet of the world's best plays, concerts, and exhibits. For instance, the Daily Mail.
Until fairly recently, the United States Embassy in Grosvenor Square was simply a place you went to if you needed a visa or wanted to tell the Yanks to go home. Now it's rapidly becoming a festival hall, come National Gallery, come Aldwych Theatre, where you can see stars who are drawing huge crowds in the West End.
From The Guardian.
Mr. Donald Ogden Stewart describes himself as the oldest living American humorist, ad-libs delightfully and reads with authority. You listen when he speaks. He is a natural.
This from the Daily Telegraph.
The New York Chamber soloists are mainly associated with elegant performances of Baroque music, but they devoted their concert at the American Embassy last night to modern works, mostly by English and American composers. Their versatility as performers, both individually and as an ensemble, ensured variety in their program.
And the London Times.
Albert Fuller has appeared recently in London playing the harpsichord in ensemble work at the Festival of American Arts and Humanities and elsewhere, and the impression of self-effacing musicianship given there was enormously widened by an outstanding solo recital at Wigmore Hall last night.
And finally, from the American Survey in the influential Economist.
The United States Information Service in London decided to put on an arts festival. First, to show what could be done on a shoestring budget, and second, to demonstrate the appetite for American art, music and literature that exists even in what Washington believes to be a culture-saturated and swinging capital city. By these standards, the festival has been an enormous success. The shoestring has been short enough to impress any congressman. There have been about 40 events with artists and scholars of the highest caliber. There have been overflow crowds at most programs. The Embassy's theatre is admittedly small, and particular enthusiasm for the jazz concerts, one of which needed larger quarters at the Royal Festival Hall. All this has been possible because patriotism has persuaded such performers as Mr. Isaac Stern and Miss Barbara Streisand to answer the plea to do something for your country by giving their services free. If more money were available, the London Embassy could make the festival a yearly event. It might even serve as a kind of friendly impresario. Many young American musicians do not know how to plan a London debut, and many painters and writers turn up fortified with financial grants, but no introductions. However, the Cultural Affairs section is now in no position to expand, with its staff cut from 63 to 37, and its funds from $350,000 to $296,000 in the last year. But those behind the festival hope to convert Congress to even loftier goals.
What about plans for the future? Dr. Martin Carroll summarizes the feelings of the Cultural Affairs staff at the Embassy.
We learned a great deal from the festival, and there are certainly ways that we did things which we would want to change. We might want to change the length of the festival a little shorter and perhaps pointed in specific directions. Having given some idea here of the vast range and variety of our cultural and educational activities, perhaps we might in the future concentrate. But on the other hand, all of this depends upon the time and the place and the persons. And in making future plans, it's very difficult to forecast these imponderables.
Well, would you be encouraged to take on something similar by at least the response that you got?
Well, if we listened only to the response, and of course that's a major thing to listen to, we'd probably take a week's vacation and start another festival all over again.
For the past hour, you've been listening to a sound documentary on the Festival of American Arts and Humanities, presented during April, May, and June of 1966 at the American Embassy in London. Our coverage has been necessarily brief and selective. Some events, such as the dance recital by Yuriko with members of the Martha Graham Company and the School of Contemporary Dance, and Jean Barrow's illustrated lecture on Stuart Davis, did not lend themselves to recording. We should also mention Thomas Parkinson's lecture on Robert Lowell and the several concert readings produced by George Mully, including Oh to Be in England and Poets on Stage. The program included interviews with Dr. Martin Carroll, Deputy Cultural Attaché and the originator of the festival, and Mr. Bernard Lang, Festival Manager and British Liaison Officer. Selections from London reviews were read by Bernard Lang, Charles Carson, William Dunn, Terence Franklin, and Alfred Aldrich, all members of the British staff at the London Embassy. Your producer and narrator has been John Whiting.